evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday evening. I am so excited to have you guys here. This is just going to be such a wonderful event. My name is McKaylee. I'm a Tattered Cover bookstore. And if this is your first time joining us with a Tattered Cover virtual event, welcome. We're so excited to have you. And if this is old hat for you and you've done this before, we're so glad to have you back. It's really due to our viewers and our supporters, the fact that Tattered Cover is still able to host these virtual events and is able to continue to be open during these very critical times for our world. And we just cannot appreciate it enough. Us and other local businesses are so excited to be having this support, because it really means that we get to continue to be a staple in the community. And right now we may not be able to come together as a community in the same way, but we can do it virtually. So we're excited to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who may be joining us around the nation, if you don't know about Tattered Cover is a local independent bookstore located in Denver, Colorado. We have 4 locations in the Denver metro area. And if you're there in Denver, in Colorado, you can still come and see us. We do have our stores open to the public. We ask that when you come in, you wear your mask over your mouth and your nose, and you come and join us for about 90 minutes or so. All of our 4 locations are open to the public, and you can still come in and buy books, buy gifts, get your stocking stuffers, because I'm telling you, November is the new December when it comes to shopping. And for those of you who may not be in our area, or if you are and you just want to stay shopping in your PJs, I totally understand. We're open 24/7 at tatteredcover.com, and you guys can shop for all your bookish needs online as well. So I want to also say, before we get started with this awesome event that we have planned tonight, that closed captioning is enabled for those who might need it. The way to enact that is all you have to do is on the screen that you're watching me on, hover your mouse over it. There's a button on the bottom of the black bar, and it says CC on it. Click that button and closed captioning will be enabled for those who might want it or need it. So again, we just want to make sure that you all know that that service is available. And now to the main event that we have here planned tonight. That's enough of my housekeeping. But so I am so excited to introduce our author of the hour. We have Sandor Katz. He is a fermentation revivalist, a self-taught experimentalist who lives in rural Tennessee. His explorations in fermentation developed out of overlapping interests in cooking, nutrition, and gardening. He is the author of 2 best-selling books, Wild Fermentation and The Art of Fermentation, which won a James Beard Foundation Award in 2013. The hundreds of fermentation workshops he has taught around the world have helped catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. The New York Times calls Sandor one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene. He is here to talk about his book, Fermentation Is Metaphor, with us, and I'm so excited to welcome Sandor Katz. And so I'm going to have him turn on his video so we can get started here. And there he is.
All right.
By the magic of technology. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for having me.
I'm obsessed with your kitchen. And I said this one right when we first said the video, but I love the color. I love the mugs and the just openness of it. It's so beautiful. Thank you for having such a thematically correct background.
Okay. Well, I mean, as it happens here in Zoom land,
Yes.
I do have the possibility of
are you going to change your background?
I do have other kinds of backgrounds.
Hey!
I have some of the microscopy from my book.
Honest, you were the first author to use pictures from their book as their background. That is such smart marketing. Good job.
But I like my kitchen too. So and it actually I find it distracting, to sort of be moving around in this bright colored field of colorized microscopy.
Nice.
So I'm really happy to be with you, and thanks so much for having me. And I love Denver and all of Colorado. So I wish I was there with y'all in person.
Us too. Well, thank you for joining us online. Can we start by you just saying what this new book is and what's it about? And how is it different than your other ones?
Okay, so I mean, my other books, which you mentioned, The Art of Fermentation and Wild Fermentation, they are practical how-to books. How to make sauerkraut, how to make yogurt, how to make kombucha, how to make country wine. They're very, practical books of, home fermentation techniques. This book, my new book, Fermentation Is Metaphor, is about fermentation, but it's more exploring some of the ways that in the English language we use fermentation as a metaphor for anything bubbly and exciting. And really, I became interested in fermentation in 1993. That's when I moved from New York, where I was born and raised, to rural Tennessee, and got involved in gardening. And the first season I was gardening, I mean, I was such a naive city kid, it hadn't occurred to me that all the cabbage would be ready at about the same time. So, when I was faced with that, obvious reality of the world, I decided I'd better learn how to make sauerkraut, because I knew sauerkraut had something to do with preservation of cabbage. And I looked in the joy of cooking. I saw how simple it was, and then I just started playing with it. Like, okay, that was really delicious and really wonderful, making a cabbage sauerkraut. What if I try that with radishes and carrots instead? I just started playing around with it and learning how to make yogurt and kombucha and country wine and sourdough. And, I just got completely obsessed. But, while I was doing this, whenever I'd be reading magazine article, and it kept jumping out at me that people would use fermentation in this metaphorical way, and talk about some place or time of great musical fermentation or political fermentation. But whenever there's like a lot of change, whenever a lot of people are excited and there's innovation, and people are literally bubbling up with ideas, like that's also fermentation. So it just while I was getting all excited about the literal phenomenon of fermentation, I kept on being reminded that fermentation is used in these broader ways. And it really comes from, it's like it's built into the word, because the word has been in our language for a very long time, much longer time than the scientific understanding of fermentation. So people have been fermenting for thousands of years, but it was really only understood as the action of microorganisms since the second half of the 19th century. And so, fermentation was always recognized by the bubbles. When you have a fermenting liquid, I'm just looking to see if anything I have is like vigorous enough that you can see the bubbles, but not really.
This is one of my favorite things, that if you had something, was the show and tell aspect of virtual events.
Well, I do have things to show and talk about, but just unfortunately, none of them are like in a vigorous bubbling stage at the moment. But, in my whole fermentation practice, like that's the exciting moment when I notice that like something is beginning to have bubbles. And the word fermentation comes from Latin fervere, which means to boil. And it's because the visible action of fermentation in liquids is the bubbles, just like the visible action of boiling in liquids. So, it's sort of built into the word that like it could describe other bubbly phenomena. And it doesn't work in every language, but in English, we've been using it for hundreds of years in these metaphorical ways. And, I've been remarking on this in all of my books and a lot of my presentations and workshops. But, I just was interested in trying to explore the metaphorical uses of the word fermentation more deeply, and then also looking at some of the other concepts or really misconcepts that people bring to fermentation, and also talk about sort of those in metaphorical ways. So this is all it keeps in this book. It keeps coming back to fermentation repeatedly. It'll be a lot more meaningful for people who've been playing around with fermentation, or at least like thinking about fermentation, observing fermentation. But what they're going to get is just sort of connecting fermentation with some bigger, some bigger ideas, rather than sort of recipes or techniques.
Right.
But just for for the hardcore fermentation fans out there, let me just say that I finished this book like just before the the COVID time, and all of my travels have been canceled. So I actually I'm more than halfway through another book that'll be coming out next year. That's like a fermentation travelogue that is back to kind of techniques, recipes, ideas. But, this was just my attempt to do something different. And also, one of my missions in relation to fermentation has been trying to encourage people to expand the context for thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, if people are thinking just about flavor, think also about nutrition. If you're thinking about it just in terms of probiotics, think about flavor. But also, think about how this phenomenon that's, so important to our culinary life, relates to all of these sort of, larger issues in the world.
I love how you make it something philosophical. You know what I mean? And you make it something that should be considered more than just beyond the scientific act of it, or the gardening aspect of it, collecting the materials. It's really this idea of taking a step beyond and making it cerebral almost in a way. And I'm curious if you could dive into or give us a hint to one of those misconceptions that you were talking about earlier that you talk about in the book, because you cover so much, but I'd love to get just a snippet of that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, specifically, the misconceptions I'm talking about are purity and contamination. Mm-hmm. And, every time I have a workshop and people watch me, chopping up cabbage, grating a radish or a carrot, preparing some vegetables to ferment, it is ridiculously easy. I love showing people how easy it is. You chop the vegetables, you could use any vegetables, you lightly salt them. It's not rocket science. You don't have to weigh everything and be precise. You can just, like any recipe in a cookbook, you can just salt it to taste. You can add other seasonings. I like to get it and squeeze it and get it all juicy and stuff it in a vessel. But then people, there's always someone at the workshop who watches me doing that, and they're like, did you sterilize that vessel? Don't you have to sterilize the vessel? And then, I mean, just a lot of people, because we've been raised to be so fearful of bacteria, and people like imagine that there could be some danger to this. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in the realm of fermenting vegetables, there is no danger. There is no documented cases of food poisoning or illness anywhere in the world. It's just like, it's about as safe as food gets. I mean, after you ferment vegetables, they're much safer than they are raw. I mean, just a couple of months ago, there was a salmonella outbreak traced to red onions. Yes. But, clearly there's the possibility of vegetables sort of being, exposed to some bacteria that could potentially be pathogenic. Usually the story is manure from a factory farm washing downhill over a field of vegetables. And so, right. You can have exposure like that ends up making people sick. But if you took vegetables that had that sort of exposure to some kind of pathogenic bacteria, and then you shred it and salt it and get it juicy and stuff it in the jar, then even though those pathogenic bacteria might be present, they're first of all always going to be outnumbered by the indigenous bacteria that are on the vegetable, which always includes lactic acid bacteria. And once you get the vegetable submerged, the lactic acid bacteria dominate every single time. And as they transform the environment and produce acids and create a more acidic environment, if there happen to be cells of salmonella or E. coli or any other organisms that we would associate with food poisoning, they die. Because, it's very convenient for us that none of the organisms we worry about making us sick can tolerate an acidic environment. So there's a real elegance to the process. But anyway, because people because so many of us have spent our whole lives being told how dangerous bacteria are, it's not hard for people to project that anxiety onto the idea of stuffing vegetables into a vessel to ferment. And how do I know my vegetables aren't going to make me sick or kill somebody? And like, this is a very real anxiety that a lot of people have. But one variant of that is like, well, surely we have to use bleach or some other kind of chemical to, sterilize the jar before we start. But no, we don't. And, sure, there's all kinds of chemicals that anybody could go buy that, could briefly sterilize a jar or a crock or whatever. And then you're going to rinse it with your water that's not sterile, and you're going to put it to dry in your dish rack that's not sterile. And certainly the air blowing around your home isn't sterile. And then you're going to pick it up with your grimy hands that you've just cleaned with soap and water, but they're still not sterile. Yeah. And so there's always going to be some incidental exposure to random organisms in the environment. But the point is that in fermentation, there's always going to be a critical mass of the organisms that you're relying upon that they will be able to dominate. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, yes, you want your tools, you want your hands, you want everything to be clean. But cleanliness is not the same as sterility, and sterility is like an extremely contrived condition. And sure, there exist laboratories where they almost get a sterile environment because they have these special ventilation systems that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the air goes through all this filtration. And
well, we don't need that for vegetables.
wearing like these outfits, but you don't need that. And traditional fermentation never had it. Yeah. And especially when we're talking about wild fermentation, which isn't a phrase that I made up, but it's used throughout the literature. And what it means is fermentation that is relying on organisms that are present on the food, then there's always going to be more than enough of whatever the organism is on the food that you don't have to worry about the random exposure, of the organism that was blowing in the wind and landed on it, or that was on the, the leg of the wasp that landed on it, or whatever. And so purity or sterilization is sort of this one idea that I think is a misconception. And look at all the ways that we use purity. I mean, purity never exists in any context. Purity is really like an abstraction and an aspiration. But look at all the ways that we use purity, whether we talk about like tests of ideological purity, whether it's people who have fantasies about racial purity or ethnic purity. So I mean, I just think as a concept, I mean, it's an erroneous concept that gets applied in all kinds of dangerous ways. And then the flip side of purity, of course, is contamination. Purity is you're protecting the vegetables you're fermenting from contamination with the random organisms that exist outside of it, or we're protecting the purity of our blood from contamination with sort of blood that's not as fine, or so I think that they're companion misconceptions, purity and contamination. Purity doesn't exist and contamination is inevitable. Yeah. So these are some of the kinds of fermentation related misconceptions that I'm also looking at in Fermentation Is Metaphor.
It's so interesting taking seriously just fermentation as a metaphor and how it can be applied to so many different things. You're talking about purity and contamination, and I'm so curious because you said you were reading about it and you kind of just noticed how people mentioned and used fermentation as a metaphor, but where did this idea come to you, and why did you decide to turn it into a book, like as your next project? Because you could keep going down the line of recipes and how-tos and techniques, and so what drew you to this concept?
Well, I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, I've always felt interested in trying to encourage people to broaden, um, um, broaden the context for their interest in fermentation, and this just seemed like a way to broaden the context for the discussion about fermentation. And I mean, I love food. I am very food obsessed, and I meet a lot of other people who are very food obsessed. But I also feel very strongly that like food is not everything.
Mhm.
And also food is like a very interesting prism through which we can look at sort of larger forces in our society. It's a really great way to look at biology and ecology
Oh yeah.
and economics and culture, and how we pass down cultural information from generation to generation. And so I'm just interested in, I mean, I love fermentation. I mean, my kitchen is full of fermentation projects. I'm drinking a glass of chicha de jora that I've been making, and I mean, I'm very motivated by the practical manifestations of fermentation, but I'm also just interested in thinking about how it relates to larger social and biological processes. And so I don't know, this book has been fermenting, if you will, in my mind um, for a while. And each of my earlier books has some limited discussion of ways that we use fermentation as a metaphor, the twin meanings of the word culture, that
Yeah.
we use the same word to describe the totality of what we seek to pass down from generation to generation: language, values, belief systems, etc. And also to describe like the bacteria that turn milk into yogurt.
Yep.
So I mean, I've been sort of drawing people's attention to these things all the time, but I just wanted to try writing something different that was like a sort of a more reflective, philosophical kind of writing. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, I found it really challenging. I mean, it's much easier for me to write how to make a chicha de jora or anything else, because it's like 1, 2, 3, 4.
Very
It's
systematic.
my certain things have a lot of steps. I've been writing a recipe for dobanjang, which is like this Sichuanese fermented condiment of chili peppers and broad beans, like fava beans.
Cool.
Really, really amazing. But like, there's a lot of steps to it. But that's easier than just like taking this once just like reflecting on a phenomenon and how it's used as a metaphor. It could go anywhere. And I mean, I took it lots of different places, but it wasn't straightforward process. At certain points it was definitely a struggle.
Well, I would love to talk about the process of the book, of not only just writing, but these pictures that you have in the book, and
Okay.
how those
Yeah.
accompanied the book in a way that not really so much in your other ones, but there's such a central piece in this book. How did
Yeah.
that come about? How did you pick the pictures? What did that process look like?
Yeah, sure. So, increasingly over time, I've been kind of like gearing up, literally like photo gear. So, I mean, for years, my only camera was my phone.
Yeah.
And, then, I got a digital SLR with a macro lens so I could get really close to things. Then I was somewhere teaching, and they had a kind of a microscope that I'd never seen that was called a stereoscope,
Ooh.
which you don't need to prepare slides. You can just put three-dimensional objects in it. It's also called a dissecting microscope. It's not as powerful as a typical slide microscope, but
Okay.
it has this advantage of you can look at three-dimensional objects under it. So after I saw that, I got one of those, and then I got a little connector to my computer so I could take photos with it. And just whenever, especially with the like the mold ferments, koji, tempeh. I mean, it just takes stunning pictures, just because those are at a scale that can really be, captured well with that level of magnification. But I wasn't really able to see much in terms of bacteria with that. And I have a slide microscope. I look at bacteria sometimes, but it's not in vivid or exciting ways. But right around the time when I was started working on this book, I made a connection with a nearby university, Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and the fermentation sciences department there directed me to the woman who maintains and runs the scanning electron microscope. And so this lovely woman, Joyce Miller, who's a technician at the university, just invited me to come and bring samples. And I showed up in her office with 40 little Tupperwares and plastic bags and jars, with different kinds of foods. And then, she walked me through the process of turning those into totally desiccated samples that we could look at under the scanning electron microscope. And so, she just generated, hundreds of gorgeous images. But when you're taking photos using electrons and not light, there's no color. So so then once I realized that, oh, these images that are just so beautiful would go great with this book, especially because usually you see microscopy images and they're illustrating specific thing. This is Lactobacillus plantarum, and then you see a picture of that. But my interest in this is less sort of teaching people to be able to recognize and distinguish between different microorganisms, but it's more just that I'm bowled over by the sheer beauty of these microbial communities, because that's the reality in fermentation, is you rarely have singular organisms. All traditional ferments are the product of these broad communities of organisms working together. And I mean, I just think that they're so beautiful. And so, I thought that, these images abstracted, meaning there's not a caption saying this is what you're looking for. It's just like, this is a beautiful image that maybe will help you see that sort of what we think of as sharp lines in the world are never that sharp, that every membrane supports smaller structures. And and it's like a complex ecosystem. And so I thought, in terms of the idea of the book of fermentation as metaphor, well, looking at these images really sort of calls into question a lot of the assumptions that we make about the nature of the world and reality. And so maybe they support the process of breaking down some of our assumptions and structures, and thematically they go along with fermentation. So that's how they ended up going together.
I'm glad they're one of my favorite parts of the book, honestly. It's so cool to look at. It makes me think. There's this one book for kids which is called Don't Lick This Book, and it's a book about germs, but they do these zoom in. There's no illustrations. They're all zoomed in microbiotic pictures of different germs and different they zoom in on a piece of paper. There's such beauty in that micro lens of things, and I love that you brought that to life within this book too. And it's something that the way that you talk about fermentation and food and this philosophical idea with such passion is such a fascinating combination of science and art. And in my head, from what I'm hearing, it is this beautiful combination of how the two work together. And you do that in this book. You really take science and bring it into philosophy and English, and, instead of the 1, 2, 3 mathematical steps. And I'm curious about why books, what drew you to the idea of writing books in this piece of art? Because that is, even if it is a step-by-step book, it still is a piece of art. What drew you to writing about fermentation? Was it just this desire to share with people? What was it about this medium
Yeah,
that
sure.
led you?
So, I mean, I would say in my life, when I have like had new interests, books have just been such important guides for me.
Yeah.
And while I did grow up in a family where, I was always expected to help out in the kitchen. And so, it's not like I was just sort of like on my own without any cooking experience. But, once I was living on my own, I found cookbooks really helpful, just in terms of like, oh, okay, there's things that I know that I like and I don't really know how to make them. And, maybe this book can help me figure out how to do it. And so, books have just been important to me. In the years before I wrote Wild Fermentation, I built a house. I'd never built a house before. I learned how to build from people, but also from books. People would talk in really general terms, and then sometimes the books and the diagrams would, really just make clear what my conversations with experienced people hadn't. So, books have just been an important way for me to learn practical things. Not to mention, fiction and just being inspired by, people's fantasies or fictional characters or whatever. But actually, the book Wild Fermentation, I will tell you the story of how this came to be.
That'd be great.
But so 1993 is the year I moved from New York to Tennessee, started gardening, started fermenting. In 1998, some friends of mine who were organizing an event that they described as a food Skillshare event invited me to be part of that and to teach a sauerkraut making workshop. And that was my first experience teaching about fermentation. And I loved it, like really from the first workshop. I had never been intimidated by the idea of fermentation for some reason. So it was a little bit of a surprise to me. All these people are like, wow, what if I get the wrong bacteria growing in there? Could it make me sick, or could it kill somebody? People had like all these questions. And, what was fun was being able to demystify it for people and help make people comfortable with the idea of it. And so this became an annual event, 1998, 1999, 2000. The summer of 2001, as it happened, I had made the decision to go and spend the summer at my friend's house in Maine. And so I was missing this event. I was not as jet set then as I later became. And it didn't occur to me to go to Tennessee for the weekend or something to go to this event. And instead I spent a month writing all my fermentation recipes down, and I self-published a little zine. I went to a Xerox shop in my friend's town in Maine and, made 50 copies of it and mailed it down to this event that I was missing. And, but as soon as I wrote that, it just dawned on me that this would be a great topic for a book. And as a younger person, so by that time I was well into my 30s, but when I was in college, I really fancied myself a writer. But so many young people who have the idea that they like to write, I had no idea what to write about. And so suddenly, I had written this, I'd written this zine that I self-published. Right away, I realized the limitations of self-publishing. And I also realized, wow, okay, this is interesting. There's more, I could learn more about this. I could write a more in-depth book. And I think that there'd be interest in it. So anyway, I went about trying to find a publisher. I just looked out, published was interested in it, and this book was the result. And I think books are really powerful. This book is in a dozen languages, each of my fermentation books has sold, I don't know, something around 200,000 copies. So I mean,
Congratulations.
it's very gratifying that, what a lot of, my friends at the time thought was a very obscure interest, turns out a lot of people are interested in fermentation. And it's especially gratifying just to see the incredible literature of fermentation that's being generated. So I mean, I'm very proud of my books, but my books are not the latter. I mean, there's just this whole amazing literature that's developed.
That's awesome. I love, and I loved how you talked about still learning and the fact that, this started out as something just, I'm obsessed with your passion. Like you see it and you hear it and when you're talking about it, and it's so just wonderful to experience when somebody's so passionate about something. And I love that it's translated into your books and talks and all of this. And I just want to say thank you for gifting us with these books and gifting us with the opportunity to learn ourselves, the fact that we can discover this from any of a number of your books. Like I never had thought about fermentation in the way that you presented it in Fermentation as Metaphor. It was very fascinating to me. My philosophy minor was very excited. But I do want to turn it over to our audience who might have questions of their own and give them an opportunity to learn alongside with us. And so if you have any questions, there's a chat box that's right next to your screen. It should be on the right side of your screen that you're watching us on. And if you have any questions, you can chat in there. The first question, and this one came up earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt you. What's in the jar you showed us? The pinkish looking one.
I'm sorry, my computer's just making a sound. I want to figure out how to make it go away.
That happens.
I don't know how to do it. So I'm just going to try to ignore it and it'll go away.
Well, we don't hear anything, if that helps. So
okay, great.
There's nothing on our end that we're hearing. Great. So the first question people had was, what's in the jar that you showed us as an example, the pinkish looking one?
Yeah, so this is just sauerkraut. So this is cabbage. There's a little bit of red cabbage in it. That's what gives it the color. There's also a little bit of carrots and onions in it. But that's what it is. It's just sauerkraut. It's as basic as it gets.
That's as basic as it gets.
I'm in the middle of a project that I love. It's a kind of a Japanese pickle called takuan.
What? Okay.
So this is a Daikon radish, right?
Okay.
It's a nice big fat Daikon radish. Look how flexible it is right now. I've been drying it in the sun for a few days, and what that does is with the top on, and that just makes it pliable. So as it loses moisture, it loses its like brittleness and crunchiness, and it becomes something pliable. And after a couple more days of drying it in the sun, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh the radishes, see how much I have. I'm going to brush them off because I never washed them in the first place. So I'll brush off any remaining soil. Then I'm going to weigh them, and then I'm going to mix rice bran and salt as a proportion of the weight of the radishes. So I'll do like 15% rice bran and about 2.5% salt, and mix them together. And then I'm going to pack these radishes into a crock, and because they're pliable, you can make them go around and make a little spiral of them. First, you do a little bit of the rice bran and salt at the bottom, then a layer of radishes, then rice bran and salt, then more radishes, then rice bran and salt. You start and end with the rice bran and salt mixture, and then a really heavy weight on it.
Okay.
And then you leave it for like 6 months or a year.
And what will that get us?
A beautiful pickle called takuan. Whole Daikon radish, and then you just slice off of it.
Okay,
every health food store in the US, you can buy takuan from Japan because it's really important for in the macrobiotic diet. So it's very widely available in the US, but usually they have food coloring added to them. But anyway, it's a beautiful process. I love this kind of pickle, and it's something that I'm in the middle of.
That's cool. Like, for lack of a better, I feel like such a nerd. Just like, that was fascinating.
And then my computer is sitting on some sake that is in process.
Sake! Look at that!
Oh, I just saw a bubble come up. There's our bubble porn.
Oh, bubbles! We did. We got our bubbles. I do want to, this is a comment, not a question, but it's very kind and endearing. And so I do want to share it with you. Mr. Katz, your books have been highly influential in my life. It inspired me to continue my family's traditions of fermenting and led me to pursue a career in sourdough. Thank you.
Okay.
So that was very kind of them. So there's another question about when COVID times are over, do you have any place you're looking forward to traveling to further your education in fermentation or discover a new food to cook? Do you have a place you're looking forward to going to?
Well, I mean, so places that where my travels got canceled during COVID. I was supposed to go to Peru, Yukon in the northwest of Canada, Iceland, and then like next week I was going to be going to Taiwan and China. So I had a lot of travels canceled, and I mean that's disappointing. But I have to say, like, just given the amount of traveling I've done, I mean, really in the last 15 years, I mean, I think that I've taught in 25 countries. So
oh
I mean,
my gosh, that's amazing.
I've taught in 38 of the states of the U.S., half the provinces of Canada, and 25 other countries. So
wow.
in a weird way, it's been a total gift for me to like be forced to not travel. And it's been a very lovely time at home. My garden's more beautiful than it ever has been. You know, I love to cook. I love to like, you know, putter around the house in the garden. I've been writing another book. So, you know, I mean, I'm not feeling like desperate to travel, but I mean, I love to travel. I love to see different places. I would say like the place that I am most excited to go. A year ago, I was in the UK teaching. And at this festival where I was presenting, this woman I was on a panel with was a microbiologist from Greenland. And she's studying the microbiology of traditional ferments of Greenland.
Wow.
And we've had a really nice correspondence, and you know, one of these years I hope to make it to Greenland. And I mean, she lives in the capital of Greenland, so a small city. But you know, if I go there, then you know, hopefully I'll get her to take me to some of the, you know, more remote places. And you know, remote places in far northern climates survive by fermentation. Like there's you know, like there's just no way that people could survive in harsh climates like that without you know, really good methods for preserving food for the winter. So so I'd be really interested in seeing Greenland. I'd love to go back to China. You know, I've spent 2 weeks of my life so far in China, and I learned so much about fermentation there. But you know, I mean, in terms of fermentation, I feel like everywhere where I go, I learn a lot. You know, fermentation is just so much, so integral to how people everywhere make effective use of whatever food resources they have available to them, that you know, there's nowhere I wouldn't be interested in going and learning about traditional ferments.
That's so great, and makes sense as to why your next project is a travel oriented fermentation book. And that's wonderful. One thing that I'm so fascinated by listening to you is just how many cultures use fermentation. Like, I don't know why, but when I was first introduced to fermentation, it was more of like this craze that was like, had a very hipster label on it. But really, when reading your books and discovering more about it, it is such a cultural, worldly, global thing that people do. It's not this new hipster trend. If anything, America's a little behind on it.
I mean, it's funny to me that, like, you know, since since about 2012, every year on these like lists of the hot new food trends, fermentation always makes it onto somebody's list of hot new food trends. And, while I can appreciate that there definitely is, growing awareness of fermentation, growing interest in fermentation, um, as a food trend, I mean, the products of fermentation have really enjoyed enduring popularity. And, if you think about beer and wine, if you think about bread and cheese, if you think about cured meats, if you think about vinegar, soy sauce, fish sauce, the chocolate, coffee, I mean, the products of fermentation have really enjoyed enduring popularity, and they were as popular in our grandparents' time as they are now. They were as popular in their grandparents' times. Wherever they were from, different ferments would have been prominent. So, I mean, I think fermentation it's really ubiquitous. I mean, it's funny because I've participated in a lot of like fermentation themed dinners,
Okay.
and it's a fun theme for organizing a dinner. But I think that virtually every restaurant in the world is serving products of fermentation. I mean, imagine like a restaurant without vinegar. What are they going to do with their salad dressing?
Nope,
Um,
not gonna happen.
yeah, so I mean, you don't have to be thinking a lot about fermentation to be able to enjoy the fruits of fermentation. But I think one of the things that's happening in our time that's exciting is people are more interested in food. And I would say, the major trajectory over the 20th century was like convenience, prepackaged, one-stop shopping. I don't want to have to think about it. I don't want to have to do anything. And I would say that, sort of since the new millennium, more and more people are recognizing that, well, okay, the products of this system of food mass production are nutritionally diminished. They're produced in ways that are very environmentally destructive, in this case of many animal products, and in cruel ways. And people just started asking questions about their food. How was this food produced? Where was it produced? By what methods was it produced? And once you start asking questions about the story of the food that you're eating, fermentation is part of the answer. So, I think that it's really great that so many more people are interested in how their food is made. So many more people are getting interested in it. There's such an explosion of small regional fermentation businesses, whether it's microbreweries or kraut makers or bread makers or cheese makers. But very little of what we eat are the raw products of agriculture. I mean, I don't see many people like eating a Daikon radish like that. And it's so all the things that we love to eat are the things that you can turn the raw products of agriculture into.
Yeah.
Or the products of nature. So fermentation just is a big part of how people make effective use of food resources everywhere. And so I mean, sure, I mean, you could say kombucha is a trend, but I don't think that like, kombucha, bread, cheese, chocolate, coffee, wine, and beer are you could really say are just like a fad.
No, I agree. But, here's to the future of more people being fascinated in what they put into their bodies and how it's made, and just continuing to grow in those interests practically and philosophically. And thank you for your work in that. I know that this viewer who spoke out is not alone, and people that you've touched and people that you've educated, I am now added to that list as somebody who went into this with zero knowledge. And I was like, what is this book? And it was so wonderful. So even for you newbies out there, and I'm sure for you seasoned fermenters, is that a thing? Is that a word?
Yeah.
That this is one that you're going to want to pick up, is Fermentation As Metaphor, which you can get at tattercover.com or at any of our locations. Sandor, I just want to say thank you for this conversation. And I want to give you a moment to just remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and any other last minute thoughts you have before we end tonight.
Great, great, great. So I am Sandor Katz. I call myself a fermentation revivalist. We are here talking about my new book, Fermentation Is Metaphor. I also have my old books, Wild Fermentation, The Art of Fermentation, and The Sleeper That Never Gets Talked About. The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved Inside America's Underground Food Movements. That is still in print.
Yay!
And I have a website which is called wildfermentation.com, and you can find out about my workshops and talks and also, I mean, I just keep on adding more links to fermentation related resources that I find on the World Wide Web. So check out my website, check out my books, and don't be intimidated. Try fermenting something if you haven't already.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little encouraged, and considering what a foodie my boyfriend is, as I hear him sizzling and cooking up our dinner in the back right now, I won't be surprised if we've got a jar or two in the next week or something. We'll see. But my name's Katie. I'm with Tattered Cover Bookstore, and I just want to thank you all again for joining us on your Monday night here. Thank you again for shopping local. Thank you for supporting us during this crazy time in our world. For some of you around the nation, it's dinner time. So maybe think about ordering from a local mom and pop restaurant and supporting other local businesses. We greatly appreciate it and would not be here without you. Sandor, if you'll stay on the line just before I cut off here, I want to thank everybody again for joining us. You can get Fermentation as Metaphor as well as Mr. Katz's other books at tatteredcover.com or visit us in person with your mask. We thank you guys again. Stay safe and happy reading. Bye, everyone.